Baby boomers control more wealth than any other generation in the entire history of the United States. Let that sink in for a second. We are talking about a generation that collectively holds more assets, more real estate, more retirement accounts, and more investment portfolios than any group of people that has ever existed in this country. And yet, if you actually sit down and talk to the average baby boomer today, you are not going to find someone who feels rich. You are going to find someone who is quietly scared about what the next 10 to 20 years are going to look like for them financially. And that right there is the contradiction that nobody is really digging into, and that is exactly what we are going to talk about today. Because here is the thing. On paper, the numbers look incredible. Baby boomers as a generation hold an estimated $78 trillion in wealth, which represents somewhere around 52% of all the wealth in the United States. That is more than double what Generation X holds, and it is more than 10 times what millennials have accumulated at this point. So if you look at those numbers from a distance, you would think that every single baby boomer in America is sitting comfortably in a paid-off home somewhere, sipping coffee on their porch with zero financial stress. But that is not the reality for the vast majority of them, and that gap between the headline number and the lived experience is exactly what nobody is talking about. The truth is that wealth, just like everything else in America, is not distributed evenly. And when you start breaking down who actually owns the bulk of that $78 trillion, the picture gets a lot less rosy for the average person in this generation. We know from research on how wealth is concentrated in this country that the top 10% of households own approximately 90% of all stock market wealth. And the same dynamic is playing out inside the baby boomer generation itself. A relatively small number of boomers at the top are holding enormous fortunes, and that is pulling the average number way up, while the majority of people in this generation are dealing with a financial reality that looks nothing like the headline suggests. So when someone says baby boomers have all the wealth, what they really mean is that some baby boomers have almost all of it. Current research is painting a really sobering picture here. Estimates are showing that roughly 2/3 of baby boomers who are entering retirement right now will not have enough money to actually maintain their current standard of living once they stop working. Think about that number for a second. 2 out of every 3 people in this generation who are reaching retirement age are not financially prepared for what comes next. More than half of baby boomers have less than $250,000 saved for retirement. And while that might sound like a decent amount of money to some people, financial planners will tell you that a comfortable retirement for a single 65-year-old actually requires closer to $900,000. So there is an enormous gap between what most people have and what they actually need, and that gap is what is driving all of this anxiety that you are seeing in this generation right now. And it gets more specific than that. The typical baby boomer who is approaching retirement is currently facing what researchers call about a 24% income gap, which translates to roughly $9,000 per year of shortfall between what they are going to need in retirement and what they actually have saved. And $9,000 a year does not sound catastrophic on its own until you factor in how long that gap is going to compound over time. Because here is something that has fundamentally changed about retirement that a lot of people in this generation were never warned about. Prior generations only spent about 10 to 15 years in retirement before passing away. That was just the reality for most of the 20th century. People worked until 65, retired, and had maybe a decade or so before their lives ended. The entire retirement savings system in this country was built around that assumption. Social Security was designed around that assumption. But the people who are retiring today are living dramatically longer than their parents did. Most people who retire now are going to spend 25 to 30 years in retirement. That is not 10 years anymore. That is potentially 3 full decades of living expenses, healthcare costs, inflation, and everything else that comes with aging, and you need to fund all of it. Essentially, you need twice the money your parents needed because you are going to live twice as long, and most people in this generation had no idea the math was going to shift like this until it was too late to do much about it. And the thing that makes this even harder to hear is that baby boomers, by and large, did exactly what they were told to do. They played by the rules that were laid out for them. They got jobs. They worked hard, often for the same company for decades. They bought homes. They put money into their 401ks and IRAs when those became available. They were told that Social Security would be there to fill in the gaps. And they believed that because for the generations before them, it actually was enough to fill in those gaps. The post-World War II economy that baby boomers grew up in was genuinely different from what we have today. The dollar was still tied to the gold standard for part of their early lives. Inflation was relatively stable, housing was affordable. The rules of the financial game in America made sense, and following them actually worked. And then, slowly and then all at once, the rules changed. Inflation exploded, housing costs went through the roof. Healthcare costs became one of the biggest financial burdens a person can face, and the purchasing power of a dollar started eroding in ways that the old retirement math was never built to handle. So you have an entire generation that spent 40 years doing the right thing, only to arrive at the finish line and discover that the race has been completely redesigned around them. That is not a minor inconvenience. That is a genuinely devastating thing to go through. And the emotional weight of this is something that does not get talked about nearly enough. There was a study not too long ago that found some retirees are so terrified of outliving their money that they said they would actually prefer to die before running out of funds. That is an extraordinary statement, and it tells you everything you need to know about how real the anxiety around retirement finances has become for this generation. We are not talking about people being mildly worried. We are talking about a genuine, deep fear of financial collapse in old age, and that fear is absolutely rational given the numbers we have been looking at. Now, one piece of genuinely good news in all of this is that 54% of baby boomers who own homes actually own them outright with no mortgage. And that is significant. Having no housing payment going into retirement is one of the single biggest factors in determining whether someone is going to be financially okay in their later years. If you are not paying rent and you are not paying a mortgage, your monthly expenses drop substantially, and that changes the math considerably. That is why financial advisors have been telling people for generations that you need to own your home free and clear before you retire. It is real advice that actually makes a real difference. But even paid-off home ownership is not a complete solution because property taxes keep rising. Homeowners insurance has gotten brutally expensive, and the cost of maintaining a home as you get older is not something to take lightly. A new roof, an HVAC system, foundation issues, any one of those can wipe out a significant portion of someone's savings in a single event. And then there is the Social Security problem, which is really the thread that ties all of this together. Because so many baby boomers are dependent on Social Security checks to actually cover their basic living expenses, the looming insolvency of the Social Security system is not just an abstract policy debate for this generation. It is a direct threat to their financial survival. The current projections say that Social Security will become insolvent by around 2032 if nothing changes, which means benefits could be cut substantially in less than 10 years. That is not a distant hypothetical. That is within the retirement window of people who are starting to retire right now. And Congress is starting to throw around proposals for how to deal with this. One of the ideas that has been getting attention recently is capping Social Security benefits at $100,000 per year for married couples. Right now, there are about 1.25 million retirees receiving at least $50,000 per year in individual benefits. And when both spouses qualify for maximum benefits, some couples are pulling in well over $100,000 a year in Social Security alone. The argument for a cap is straightforward. The people receiving that much in benefits are already among the wealthiest retirees in the country, and limiting their annual growth could save somewhere between $100 and $190 billion over the next decade. It would not fully solve the solvency problem, but it would buy time. But here is where it gets complicated. The people receiving those high benefits paid into the system at the maximum level their entire working lives. They were told explicitly that contributing more meant receiving more. And now there is a proposal on the table that would effectively change that agreement after the fact. It is the same problem we keep seeing everywhere in this story. People follow the rules they were given, and then the rules change on them at the worst possible moment. Whether you think the cap is fair policy or not, you have to acknowledge that there is something genuinely troubling about a government that tells its citizens one thing for 40 years, and then changes the terms when people are already in retirement. The other common proposal you hear is simply raising the income cap on social security taxes, meaning people who earn more would pay more into the system. That sounds simple and fair until you realize that every single time taxes have been expanded in American history, they eventually trickle down to everyone. Income taxes started as something only the wealthiest Americans paid. That was literally the original design. And then, after World War II, they became universal, and they have only gone up since then. So, the history of tax policy in this country does not exactly inspire confidence that any solution aimed at high earners is going to stay targeted at high earners forever. And that is really the darkest part of this whole story. When you zoom out and look at the big picture, there is no clean solution here. Someone is going to take a loss. Either current workers are going to have more taken out of their paychecks to fund benefits for people who are retired now, or current retirees are going to receive less than they were promised, or some combination of both. And the government, as it tends to do, seems far more interested in finding ways to kick the can down the road than in actually solving the problem. Every proposal you see is about buying more time, not about genuinely fixing the structural imbalance. And when you look at the pattern, it is hard not to conclude that the people making these decisions have no real intention of ever solving it. They just want to keep the current system limping forward long enough that the crisis becomes the next administration's problem. So if you are a baby boomer watching this, the uncomfortable takeaway is this. The system you trusted and contributed to your whole life is under serious strain, and the safety nets you were counting on may not perform the way you expected. And if you are younger and watching this, the lesson is equally uncomfortable. The rules of the financial game will change on you too. They always do. The only real protection is building something that does not depend on the government to keep its promises. That is the thing nobody is talking about, and it is the most important thing you could be thinking about right now. Make sure you subscribe so you do not miss what is coming next, because this story is far from over.